My name is Bonnie Blair. I'm 38 years old, a financial analyst by profession, a wife of 13 years, and a mother of one thoughtful, observant 10-year-old who sees more than we think he does. Most people would describe me the same way: steady, practical, calm. The woman who remembers birthdays, renews insurance policies before they expire, and keeps receipts filed by month and year. At dinner parties, I'm the one refilling water glasses while louder personalities tell animated stories. At work, I'm the one who catches the decimal error before it becomes a headline. No one has ever called me dramatic, and that's important. Because when people hear that a marriage is almost broken, they assume betrayal, a secret phone, a late night, lipstick on a collar. But this isn't that kind of story. There was no affair, no scandal, no screaming match that shattered plates against tile. What nearly ended my marriage was quieter than that. It was unpaid bills folded into drawers, credit card statements left unopened, different philosophies about living for today, the slow, unspoken panic of watching numbers drift in directions you know they shouldn't. It was the weight of being the only one who checked the mailbox with a tight chest, the only one calculating due dates in my head during bedtime stories, the only one lying awake at 2:17 a.m., wondering how love could feel so solid and yet so financially fragile. And the hardest part? We weren't fighting. We were functioning. We smiled in public, hosted holidays, took photos on vacations we probably shouldn't have taken. We told ourselves it was just a phase, that stress was normal, that marriage meant compromise. But somewhere between compromise and avoidance, resentment grows roots. This story isn't about revenge. It isn't about humiliating anyone or proving I was right. It's about something much quieter. The moment a woman realizes she cannot carry the emotional and financial weight of two adults forever. It's about what happens when silence stops being patience and starts becoming self-betrayal. There was a day, small, ordinary, when something shifted inside me. I didn't yell, I didn't threaten to leave, I didn't even cry. I simply decided that clarity would replace comfort. And once you choose clarity, you can't unchoose it. Over the next hour, I'll tell you how unpaid bills, mismatched spending habits, and conversations we avoided almost dissolved a marriage that, on the surface, looks stable. I'll tell you what I learned about partnership, power, and the difference between love and responsibility. Most importantly, I'll tell you what changed, not just in my marriage, but in me. Have you ever stayed quiet about something important because you were afraid of what the truth might cost? To the outside world, I was the organized one. Friends would laugh and say, "If the apocalypse comes, I'm going to Bonnie's house. She'll have spreadsheets for it." My husband, Daniel, used to say it fondly, with a smile that suggested admiration, but also relief. Relief that he didn't have to be that person. In our marriage, I was the system. I set up autopay, I tracked subscriptions, I remembered when the car insurance was renewed, and when the property taxes were due. I knew the difference between our fixed expenses and our flexible ones, though flexible had a funny way of stretching. Daniel, on the other hand, was the energy, the charisma, the one who could walk into a room and leave with three new friends and an invitation to something spontaneous. He believed money was fluid, replaceable, a tool for living fully. I believed money was structure, stability, protection. When we first married, those differences felt complementary. He made me loosen up. I made sure the lights stayed on. It seemed balanced. But balance shifts quietly. At family gatherings, if conversations turned to finances, Daniel would wave his hand and say, "Oh, Bonnie handles all that. I just earned it." It was meant to be lighthearted, but it placed me in a role: the administrator, the backstage crew, the invisible operator of adulthood. People would nod approvingly. "You're lucky to have her," they'd tell him. And he was, but so was I. At least that's what I told myself. Because Daniel worked hard. He provided well. He wasn't reckless in the obvious ways. He didn't gamble. He didn't hide accounts. He didn't lie. He just didn't look. Didn't look at statements. Didn't look at due dates. Didn't look at the slow creep of lifestyle inflation. And because I looked, it became mine. There's a strange invisibility in competence. When you handle something well enough, people forget it requires effort at all. They assume stability is natural, like gravity. No one asks gravity if it's tired. At dinner parties, when couples joked about arguments over money, I would smile politely. "We're fine," I'd say, and we were, technically. We weren't in debt spirals, we weren't fighting over secret purchases. But there was a quiet imbalance that no one saw. If a bill was late, it was because I hadn't reminded him enough. If our savings dipped, it was because something unexpected came up. If I hesitated before agreeing to a weekend trip, I was being cautious again. Cautious, careful, conservative. Those words became shorthand for small, limiting, and slightly rigid. Never responsible, never protective. I don't think Daniel meant to minimize what I carried. He simply trusted that I would carry it. And because I loved him, I did. I told myself this was a partnership, dividing tasks according to strengths. I was good with money, he was good with people, I was structured, he was spontaneous. But over time, something subtle happened. I stopped being a partner and started being a buffer between reality and his comfort, between due dates and his optimism, between anxiety and his ability to sleep soundly. I would lie awake calculating upcoming expenses while he breathed evenly beside me. I never woke him. It felt unnecessary, almost unfair. Why burden him with numbers when I could manage them? That was who I was to them. The reliable one, the steady one, the woman who would handle it. And when you are known for handling everything, people stop asking whether you should have to. The first crack didn't look like a crack. It looked like a vacation. Daniel had just closed a strong quarter at work. Bonuses were higher than expected. He came home glowing, the kind of glow that fills a room before the door even shuts. We should celebrate, he said, dropping his keys on the counter. Not just dinner, a real trip. Hawaii, or maybe Italy. Italy! I remember the way the word floated in the kitchen like perfume. And for a moment, I let myself imagine it. Stone streets, espresso in small white cups, sunlight on old buildings. I wanted that version of us. Relaxed, adventurous, unburdened. But later that night, after he fell asleep, I opened my laptop. The bonus was generous, but our emergency fund wasn't where I wanted it to be. The roof would likely need repairs within a year. Our son's education savings account was steady, but not aggressive. We could take the trip, but it would mean pausing progress. The next morning, I approached him carefully. What if we did something smaller? Maybe a long weekend instead of 2 weeks overseas, just until we rebuild the cushion a bit. He smiled, but it was thinner. Bonnie, he said gently, like I was a cautious child. We work hard. We deserve to live a little. It's not like we're broke. We're not broke. That sentence stayed with me, because not being broke isn't the same as being secure. I tried to explain it. I showed him projections, not to control him, just to create visibility. But halfway through my explanation, I could see it in his posture. The slight lean back, the polite nod, the emotional disengagement. You think too far ahead, he said. Sometimes you have to trust that things will work out. Trust. As if caution were distrust, as if preparation were pessimism. We booked Italy, and for those 2 weeks it was beautiful. We laughed. We took photos. We told ourselves this is what life is about. But when we came home, the credit card statement arrived before the jet lag wore off. There were small charges Daniel hadn't mentioned. Upgraded hotel rooms, extra excursions. It was worth it, he said when I pointed them out. We were already spending the money. Already spending the money? I paid the balance in full, because that's what I do. But it meant transferring from savings. It meant adjusting timelines quietly. That was the first small cut. Not the trip, not even the extra charges. It was the realization that we were not operating from the same definition of safety. For him, safety was income, momentum, confidence in future earnings. For me, safety was numbers that didn't require hope to hold them together. And no one else noticed. Our friends saw the photos. They commented with heart emojis. Couple goals, someone wrote. They didn't see me at midnight recalculating projections. They didn't see the way I swallowed the discomfort because I didn't want to be the woman who ruins the fun. That was the first time I felt it, that quiet internal split between who I was and who I was expected to be. I told myself it wasn't a big deal. It was just a trip. But small cuts don't hurt because of their size. They hurt because of what they reveal. After Italy, nothing dramatic happened. That's the part people misunderstand about financial strain. It rarely explodes. It accumulates. Life resumed its rhythm. School drop-offs, client meetings, grocery lists. Daniel worked late some evenings. I updated spreadsheets on Sundays. And yet something subtle had shifted inside me. It started with jokes. If we were out with friends and someone mentioned budgeting, Daniel would grin and gesture toward me. Don't say that word around Bonnie. She'll make you open a retirement account before dessert. Everyone would laugh, including me, because it was harmless, right? But humor has a way of revealing hierarchy. I was becoming the cautionary tale, the overly responsible one, the woman who worried too much. At home, small purchases began slipping through without conversation. A new sound system, a premium streaming subscription I hadn't approved, upgrades to things that were functioning perfectly fine. Individually, none of them was catastrophic. Collectively, they shifted the baseline. When I brought them up, Daniel would sigh, not angrily, just tiredly. Do we really have to analyze every little thing? Every little thing. I started second guessing myself. Was I being rigid? Was I measuring too closely? He wasn't hiding anything. He wasn't secretive. The statements were right there. He just didn't see them as consequential. And slowly, I began to adjust. I delayed conversations because I didn't want to dampen his mood after a long day. I told myself timing mattered. I told myself marriage required flexibility. The more I absorbed, the less he noticed. When a utility bill was higher than expected, I didn't mention it. I recalibrated elsewhere. When our savings growth slowed, I worked overtime instead of addressing spending. When I felt anxiety rise in my chest, I labeled it personal stress, not systemic imbalance. This is how disrespect becomes normalized, not through cruelty, not through shouting, through repetition, through the quiet expectation that one person will compensate. There was a night, small, almost forgettable, that I think about often. I was at the dining table with my leather-bound budget journal open. The color-coded tabs had started to look less like organization and more like containment. Daniel walked past, kissed the top of my head, and said, "I don't know what I'd do without you handling all that. I'd be lost." It sounded like gratitude, but it felt like an assignment. Lost. As if financial responsibility were a language he didn't need to learn because I was fluent. And I realized something uncomfortable. By handling everything quietly, I was reinforcing the very imbalance that exhausted me. He wasn't dismissing me maliciously, he simply trusted that I would continue to absorb. And because I rarely pushed back, the pattern hardened. The truth is, I didn't want conflict. I didn't want to be the woman who turned love into spreadsheets. I wanted ease. I wanted to believe that shared life meant shared weight, even if we carried it differently. But weight doesn't disappear just because you redistribute it unevenly. It settles somewhere. And in our marriage, it was settling in me. I still told people we were fine, because technically we were. We weren't fighting. We weren't drowning. But something inside me had started to bruise. And bruises don't show until pressure is applied. It wasn't a conversation that revealed the role I'd been assigned. It was a pattern. Patterns don't announce themselves. They repeat until they feel inevitable. One Sunday afternoon, Daniel hosted a last-minute barbecue. Just a few friends, he said casually, already texting invitations. I glanced at the calendar. It was the same week our property tax installment was due. I felt the familiar tightening in my chest. Maybe we should keep it simple, I suggested. We've got a few larger payments this week. He waved a hand dismissively. It's just food, Bon. We're not buying a yacht. Just food. I nodded and went to the store. By the time guests arrived, the patio looked effortless. Music played softly. Drinks are chilled in metal tubs. Daniel stood in the center of it all, laughing, flipping burgers, telling stories. I refilled bowls, replaced napkins, smiled. At one point, one of our friends said, "You two make it look so easy. Power couple." I almost laughed, because what they saw was harmony. What they didn't see was division. Daniel handled the atmosphere. I handled the aftermath. After the guests left and the dishes were done, I returned to my journal. I adjusted projections again, moved funds between accounts, postponed a small contribution to savings to compensate for just food. That's when it became clear. My role wasn't just a financial manager. It was a stabilizer. I absorbed fluctuations so he could remain buoyant. At work, I often led risk assessments. We'd identify vulnerabilities before they became crises. I was respected for that foresight. It was considered leadership. At home, the same instinct was labeled caution. I started noticing language. When Daniel made spontaneous purchases, it was treating ourselves. When I hesitated, it was overthinking. When he wanted to expand our lifestyle, it was growth. When I wanted to strengthen our foundation, it was playing it safe. Somewhere along the way, responsibility had become less glamorous than optimism, and I had accepted the quieter role. Reliable, useful, invisible. There's a particular loneliness in being competent. People admire it, depend on it, but they don't necessarily value the cost of it. I realized that if I stopped managing everything tomorrow, chaos wouldn't erupt immediately. There would be a grace period, because I had built one, and that grace period was invisible labor. I began asking myself a question I hadn't allowed before. If something happened to me, if I were suddenly unavailable, Would Daniel know how to navigate our financial life? The honest answer was no, not because he wasn't intelligent, but because he had never needed to. I had made it unnecessary. That was the role I had accepted and reinforced. Not a partner, not a co-strategist. Safety net, and safety nets are rarely thanked unless they fail. That realization didn't make me angry. It made me tired. Tired in a way that sleep doesn't fix, because it wasn't about money anymore. It was about equity, not just in income, but in awareness. And awareness, once it sharpens, is hard to dull again. That was the moment I understood something quietly powerful. If I wanted the dynamic to change, I couldn't just keep compensating. I would have to let reality be shared, even if it made things uncomfortable. It wasn't a fight. It wasn't a dramatic discovery or a slam door. It was a Tuesday, ordinary, gray, quiet. I had just come home from work and stopped at the mailbox on the way in. Among the usual flyers and school notices was a thin envelope from the credit card company, not the monthly statement, but something smaller. A late notice, $34.17. The amount was almost laughable. We could have paid it 10 times over without strain. That wasn't the point. The point was that I hadn't seen it coming. I stood in the kitchen holding that envelope longer than necessary. I replayed the previous weeks in my head. I had assumed the statement was covered. I had trusted the autopay setting Daniel insisted he'd updated after using the card for a series of online purchases. He had said, "I'll handle it." And for once, I had let him. Not as a test, not as a trap, just because I was tired. Daniel walked in a few minutes later, cheerful as usual, asking about dinner plans. I handed him the notice calmly. "Oh," he said, glancing at it. "That's weird. Must have been a glitch." A glitch. I watched him as he opened his laptop. The autopay hadn't been set up correctly. The minimum hadn't processed. The due date had passed quietly. "It's just a small fee," he added. "Not a big deal." But something inside me tightened in a way that wasn't about $34. It was about trust and shared responsibility. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't lecture him about consequences or credit scores. I simply nodded and said, "Okay." And then I went upstairs. I sat on the edge of our bed, the envelope still in my hand. What unsettled me wasn't the mistake. It was how differently we felt about it. For him, it was an inconvenience, a minor administrative hiccup. For me, it was proof of what I had quietly feared. If I stopped watching, things slipped. Not catastrophically, not dramatically, just enough. And I realized something uncomfortable. I had been telling myself a story. The story was that we were a team, just with different strengths. But a team implies redundancy, backup, overlap. We didn't have that. We had specializations so extreme that if one person faltered, the system faltered. And I was the only one double-checking. That evening, after our son went to bed, Daniel tried to make light of it again. "You're not still thinking about that, are you?" I looked at him, really looked at him. And I understood something for the first time with complete clarity. He didn't see what I saw because he had never had to feel the weight I felt. And I had shielded him from it so well that he didn't know it existed. That was the shift. Not anger, not resentment, clarity. Clarity that love without shared responsibility becomes an imbalance. Clarity that silence, even when motivated by peace, can create distortion. Clarity that if I continued absorbing everything quietly, nothing would change because nothing would need to. For the first time, I didn't feel the urge to explain myself. I felt the urge to step back. Not to punish, not to withdraw affection, but to stop buffering reality. I placed the late notice inside my journal, not as evidence against him, but as a marker, a line in the sand that only I could see. And from that day forward, something in me became deliberate. Not louder, just intentional. After the late notice, I didn't announce a new system. I didn't schedule a serious talk. I didn't deliver a speech about accountability. I did something far quieter. I stopped overfunctioning. Not recklessly, not irresponsibly, strategically. There's a difference between silence born from fear and silence chosen with intention. Before, I stayed quiet to keep the peace. Now I stayed quiet to observe. The next time a bill arrived addressed to Daniel, I placed it on his desk instead of opening it. I didn't text reminders. I didn't hover. If he asked a question, I answered it. If he didn't, I let it sit. At first, nothing happened, because habits don't unravel immediately. But small signs began to appear. A subscription renewal lapsed and temporarily cut off access to one of his favorite platforms. He called out from the living room, confused. "I thought you handled that." "I don't have the login," I replied calmly. "It's under your email." There was a pause. "Oh, right." He fixed it. A few weeks later, the car registration notice arrived. I placed it on the kitchen counter without comment. Days passed. Then one evening, Daniel mentioned it casually. Did you take care of the registration? I haven't, I said evenly. It's in your name. He blinked. Not annoyed, just surprised. Since when? Since it was renewed last year. The truth was simple. I had always taken initiative. Even when something wasn't technically mine, I managed it. It was easier that way. Now I was allowing natural ownership to surface. To him, my quiet shift probably felt like forgetfulness. To me, it was recalibration. There's a discomfort that comes when you stop compensating. You watch small inefficiencies unfold. You resist the urge to correct them immediately. And that resistance feels unnatural. I had to sit with my own anxiety, the instinct to jump in, smooth over, solve. But solving everything had created a dependency loop neither of us consciously acknowledged. I wasn't trying to teach him a lesson. I was trying to rebalance reality. Interestingly, Daniel didn't accuse me of changing. He simply began asking more questions. Where do you keep the property tax records? What account is the emergency fund in again? When is the credit card due? Each question revealed something important. He didn't lack capability. He lacked exposure. And I had been the gatekeeper, unintentionally. But silence has power when paired with consistency. I didn't scold. I didn't dramatize. I didn't say, see, this is what I've been dealing with. I answered factually. Over time, he began checking things before I did. Not perfectly, not comprehensively, but noticeably. There was one evening when he sat beside me at the dining table while I updated the budget journal. Walk me through it, he said. Just 4 words. Not defensive, not sarcastic. Curious. I felt something shift again, softer this time. Because silence, when chosen intentionally, doesn't create distance. It creates space, space for awareness to grow without humiliation. But I also understood something critical. Had I continued overfunctioning, that moment would never have arrived. People rise to responsibility when it's visible, and I had finally made it visible, not through confrontation, but through restraint. Still, the process was fragile, because even with progress, the underlying stress wasn't fully addressed yet. We were adjusting behavior, but we hadn't yet confronted the bigger difference in philosophy, and that difference was still there. Quiet, waiting. From the outside, nothing dramatic changed. We still hosted dinners, we still posted vacation photos. Shorter trips now, more intentional. We still looked like a stable couple navigating ordinary life. What no one noticed was what I had started building quietly behind the scenes. Not a secret account, not an escape plan in the dramatic sense. A foundation. I began documenting everything with new precision. Not obsessively, but deliberately. I updated our net worth statement monthly instead of quarterly. I categorized expenses with more nuance. I separated discretionary spending from structural obligations in a way that made patterns undeniable. At work, I had always believed that clarity reduces conflict. Numbers tell stories without shouting, so I decided to let the numbers speak. But I didn't present them yet. First, I studied them. I traced the emotional rhythm of our spending. Bonuses triggered generosity. Stress triggered convenience purchases. Social events triggered upgrades. It wasn't recklessness, it was mood-driven behavior. And I realized something uncomfortable about myself, too. Anxiety triggered control. When I felt uncertain, I tightened. I restricted. I recalculated. We weren't opposites. We were reacting differently to the same underlying pressure. That understanding softened me, but it didn't erase the imbalance. So I prepared. I met with a financial advisor alone under the pretense of long-term planning. Not to move money without Daniel's knowledge, but to understand options, estate planning, asset protection, contingency frameworks. I asked questions I had never asked before. If one partner disengages financially, what safeguards should exist? What structures ensure transparency without surveillance? What does equitable responsibility actually look like in numbers? The advisor didn't know the emotional context. He simply gave me tools, and tools create confidence. At home, I reorganized our digital files, shared access folders, clear labels, password management systems we could both see. I wasn't preparing to leave. I was preparing for reality, whatever form it took. Because here's what they never noticed. When a woman begins documenting, instead of complaining, something fundamental has shifted. Complaints seek validation. Documentation seeks clarity, and clarity is quite powerful. There were evenings when Daniel would glance over as I updated spreadsheets. You really love this stuff, he'd joke lightly. I smiled. What he didn't see was that I was no longer updating them out of habit. I was updating them out of self-respect. I also began strengthening my own financial independence. I negotiated a raise I had delayed asking for. I increased contributions to my personal retirement account. I updated beneficiaries and reviewed insurance coverage. None of it was secret, but none of it was announced either. It was simply responsible adulthood, extended to myself, not just the marriage. And something else began happening internally. The fear that had once driven my vigilance started to settle. Because fear thrives on uncertainty, preparation replaces it with options. Options are calming. For the first time in years, I realized that if our marriage ever faced true strain, I would not be financially trapped, not dependent, not scrambling. But that realization didn't make me cold. It made me steady, and steadiness changes how you speak. It changes how you negotiate. It changes what you tolerate. Daniel began sensing something, not distance, but composure. "You seem different lately," he said one evening. Different how? Less stressed, but also harder to read. That was accurate, because I was no longer absorbing silently. I was observing, preparing, and positioning. And the irony? I wasn't preparing to win against him. I was preparing so that, if we were to move forward, it would be as two fully aware adults, not one carrying the weight and the other floating above it. No one else saw this phase. To them, we were the same couple. But internally, I had crossed from reactive to intentional. And once you become intentional, you can't return to unconscious patterns without noticing the cost. What they never noticed was that the foundation beneath our marriage was being quietly reinforced, not just structurally, but emotionally. Because clarity, even when uncomfortable, is a form of love, but it is also a form of boundary, and boundaries once formed don't dissolve easily. The reveal wasn't dramatic. There was no hidden account, no secret debt, no betrayal waiting to be exposed. The reveal was quieter than that. It was a spreadsheet. One Saturday morning, Daniel left early to meet a friend for coffee. The house was still. I sat at the dining table with my laptop open, reviewing our updated financial dashboard. Income streams, fixed costs, discretionary patterns, projected growth over 5, 10, 15 years. I ran two simulations. Scenario A, we continue as we have been. Mild inconsistency, occasional overspending during high-income months, inconsistent reinforcement of savings goals. Scenario B, shared oversight, structured discretionary caps, aligned long-term priorities. The difference over 15 years was staggering. Not catastrophic in Scenario A. We wouldn't be ruined, we wouldn't be destitute, but we would plateau. Plateau in net worth, plateau in security, plateau in options. And that's when it became clear. This wasn't about bills, it was about the trajectory. Money amplifies philosophy. Daniel believed momentum would always compensate for fluctuation. That income growth would outrun inefficiency. I believed systems determine sustainability. That discipline compounds more reliably than optimism. Both views contain truth, but only one builds resilience without requiring constant acceleration. That was the private reveal. If something disrupted our income, an economic downturn, illness, or industry change, our current structure depended heavily on continued success. We weren't fragile, but we weren't fortified. And I understood something even deeper. My anxiety had never truly been about spending. It was about exposure. Exposure to variables we were pretending didn't exist. I leaned back in my chair and stared at the projections. For years, I had framed the tension as a personality difference. Cautious versus spontaneous. Structured versus relaxed. But the numbers reframed it. This was about shared responsibility for risk. And risk feels abstract until it doesn't. In that quiet kitchen, sunlight filtering across the table, I experienced something I hadn't felt in a long time. Certainty. There is no certainty that we would fail. Certainty that continuing without alignment would slowly erode respect. Because here's what happens when one partner carries invisible risk management alone. They begin to feel like the adult in the room. And no marriage survives long when one person feels like the adult and the other feels like the optimist. The reveal wasn't something I confronted Daniel with immediately. It was something I absorbed. I closed the laptop and sat with it. There was no anger, no resentment spike, just clarity. If I wanted a partnership, I would have to require it. Do not demand it emotionally. Require it structurally. Require visibility. Require shared review. Require participation. Love without accountability had brought us here. Love with accountability might take us somewhere stronger. But there was another quiet truth beneath it all. If he resisted, if he dismissed alignment again, I would not continue absorbing silently. That realization didn't scare me. It steadied me, because preparation had given me leverage. Not over him, but over fear. I now knew exactly where we stood. And knowing where you stand removes desperation from your voice. When Daniel came home later that morning, he kissed my cheek and asked what I'd been doing. Running projections, I said simply. He laughed lightly. Of course you were. I smiled. He didn't know yet that those projections had changed something fundamental inside me. There would be a conversation soon. Not heated, not dramatic, decisive. Because once you see the long-term truth in numbers, you can't unsee it. And pretending becomes heavier than confrontation. The decision didn't happen in a moment of anger. It happened in a moment of stillness. A week after I ran the projections, Daniel and I sat on the couch after dinner. Our son was upstairs reading. The house was calm, the kind of ordinary quiet that makes hard conversations feel almost inappropriate. I brought my laptop into the living room. Can we look at something together? I asked. Not confrontational, not tense, just direct. He hesitated slightly, not because he feared conflict, but because he anticipated complexity. Numbers had always been my territory. Sure, he said. I opened the two scenarios. I didn't dramatize them. I didn't say, we're heading toward disaster. I simply walked him through the math. Current income, current expenses, variability patterns, compounding effects. Then I showed him the long-term difference. He leaned forward. For once, he didn't lean back. That big of a gap? He asked quietly. Yes. We sat there with it. No accusation, no defensiveness, just information. This isn't about restricting you, I said calmly. It's about shared oversight. Right now, our stability depends heavily on continued momentum. That works until something interrupts it. He was quiet longer than usual, and then he said something that surprised me. I didn't realize you felt like you were carrying this alone. I studied his face carefully. There was no sarcasm, no dismissal, just a realization. And here's where the decision point emerged. I had two options. Option one, soften it, reassure him, say, it's okay, I've got it. Continue being the stabilizer, just with more acknowledgement. Option two, tell the full truth, the irreversible one. I don't want to carry it alone anymore, I said evenly, not because I can't, because I shouldn't. There it was, simple, clean, not an ultimatum, not a threat, a boundary. Daniel nodded slowly. So what does shared oversight look like? That question mattered more than any apology. I had prepared for this. Monthly financial reviews, both of us, no autopilot, discretionary caps we agree on in advance. And if either of us wants to exceed them, we talk first. He absorbed it. That feels structured, he said. It is. Another pause. Okay, he replied finally. Let's do it. And yet, even in that agreement, I understood something quietly critical. Words do not change. Systems are changing. The decision I made that night wasn't just to require partnership. It was to stop buffering discomfort if the agreement faltered. If he skipped a review, we wouldn't pretend it didn't matter. If spending exceeded our caps, we wouldn't rationalize it away. This wasn't about control. It was about consequence. Not a punitive consequence, natural consequence. And internally, I made one more decision, one I didn't announce. If alignment proved temporary, if participation faded once the discomfort passed, I would reevaluate more than just spreadsheets. Because respect, once compromised by imbalance, doesn't fully recover without sustained effort. Daniel closed the laptop gently. Thank you for showing me, he said. And for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel like the adult in the room. I felt like one half of a conversation. But clarity changes tone. From that night forward, the marriage would either deepen or it would expose its limits. And I was prepared for either outcome. Agreement is easy in the moment. Implementation reveals character. The first monthly review felt almost ceremonial. We sat at the dining table, my leather-bound journal open, his laptop beside it. I walked through categories. He asked questions, real ones, not performative, not defensive. We set discretionary caps together. We rebalanced contributions. We automated transfers with dual visibility, alerts sent to both of us. On the surface, it looked like progress, and it was. But I understood something essential. Consistency over time would determine whether this was a transformation or temporary compliance. So I moved quietly, not in secrecy, in discipline. I created a shared financial calendar. Every due date, renewal, and quarterly review is mapped clearly. No more invisible mental tracking. If something was late, it would be visible to both of us. I consolidated accounts for transparency, not control. Separate personal discretionary funds, clearly defined. Joint obligations are equally visible. At work, I had seen what happens when accountability lacks structure. People rely on intention. Intention fades. Structure endures. I also made a subtle internal shift. If Daniel forgot something now, I would not intercept before it became visible. Not to punish, but to reinforce shared responsibility. And something interesting began to happen. He started checking balances without prompting. He initiated one of the reviews when I was delayed at work. Thought we'd stick to the schedule, he said casually when I came home. Casually but deliberately. Still, I didn't relax completely. Because patterns don't dissolve overnight. There was a week when he suggested upgrading his car earlier than planned. The old one worked fine, but a new model had caught his attention. The old version of me would have researched financing options immediately, preparing to make it work safely. Instead, I asked one question. Does it fit inside the cap we agreed on? He hesitated. No. Then we revisit it next quarter. No lecture, no tension, just alignment with our structure. He nodded. And for the first time, I saw something shift in his expression, not frustration. Respect. Moving in silence doesn't mean withdrawing emotion. It means allowing systems to speak before conflict does. Behind the scenes, I continued strengthening our contingency plans. Emergency fund now fully funded. Insurance coverage updated. Estate planning documents drafted. Reviewed together, signed together. Not because I expected disaster, because maturity requires preparation, and internally something else was stabilizing. I no longer felt the constant hum of low-grade anxiety, not because everything was perfect, because everything was visible. Visibility reduces fear, and fear had been the quiet undercurrent of our tension. Daniel seemed lighter, too. Oddly enough, shared responsibility had initially felt like pressure to him, but over time, it looked more like relief. Relief that he no longer relied on my silent vigilance. Relief that expectations were clear. There were still differences between us. He remained more spontaneous. I remained more structured. But now spontaneity operated within boundaries, and boundaries protected both of us. Still, I kept one truth close. If structure began slipping, if reviews were skipped repeatedly, if we drifted back into imbalance, I would not revert to buffering. Moving in silence had taught me something powerful. Change doesn't require volume. It requires consistency. And consistency reveals whether love is strong enough to mature or only strong enough to survive comfort. The next few months would tell, because systems don't just organize money. They expose commitment. The consequences didn't arrive as punishment. They arrived as an adjustment. When you change a long-standing dynamic, even gently, there is friction. Not explosive friction, structural friction, the kind you feel when muscles you haven't used in years begin to engage. The first shift was social. Daniel started hesitating before agreeing to expensive group plans, not declining, hesitating. We'll check the calendar, he'd say, or let me confirm something first. Our friends noticed. You two getting strict over there? Someone joked one night. Daniel laughed, but this time he didn't gesture toward me as the punchline. We're just being intentional, he replied. Intentional? That word mattered. But intentionality has consequences. There were fewer impulsive upgrades, fewer last-minute splurges, fewer we'll figure it out later moments. And with that, something else surfaced. Discomfort. One evening, after declining an expensive weekend trip with friends, Daniel seemed restless. I feel like we're shrinking, he admitted. I didn't react defensively. In what way? Like we used to say yes more. I let the silence sit before answering. We used to say yes without looking. That wasn't criticism. It was a fact. He rubbed his temples lightly. I don't want to feel constrained. And there it was, the emotional core. To me, structure felt stabilizing. To him, it initially felt limiting. But here's the part no one talks about. When one partner stops overcompensating, the other partner begins to feel the weight they were previously shielded from. Not as punishment. As reality, Daniel began noticing due dates, fluctuations, timing. He began seeing the invisible calculations I had carried alone for years. And that visibility changed him, but it also unsettled him. There was a small argument one Thursday night. Not loud, not dramatic, just tired. I didn't realize how much you were tracking, he said. It's exhausting. Yes, I replied calmly, it is. That was the first time he experienced it directly, and it softened something in him. The consequences weren't financial collapse. They weren't dramatic threats. They were awareness that lifestyle requires maintenance, awareness that comfort has infrastructure, awareness that optimism without oversight creates quiet vulnerability. But there was another consequence, one that surprised me. Our conversations deepened, because once we stopped buffering discomfort, we had to actually discuss priorities. What kind of retirement did we want? Did we value flexibility more than growth? Were we building for appearance or resilience? These weren't spreadsheet questions. They were identity questions. And they weren't easy. There were moments when Daniel seemed nostalgic for the old dynamic, when spontaneity came without calculation. But slowly, something shifted in his tone. I feel more in control now, he admitted one night after completing a review himself. Control, not restriction. Ownership, not oversight. And that was the difference. The consequences of clarity are temporary discomfort and long-term stability. But there's always a fragile phase, a window where either partner can retreat, where old habits can quietly return. I stayed consistent, not rigid, not cold, just steady, because consequences aren't about punishment. They're about recalibration, and recalibration requires patience. The real question wasn't whether Daniel could adapt. It was whether we could sustain the adaptation without resentment. That answer would reveal itself soon, because temporary effort is easy. Sustained maturity is not. There's a moment in every slow transformation where you realize the old version of your relationship is gone. Not destroyed, just unavailable. For us, that moment came 6 months into our new structure. We were sitting at the dining table during one of our scheduled reviews. The numbers were stronger now. Emergency funds solid. Discretionary spending is controlled, investments consistent. On paper, we were healthier than we had ever been. And yet, Daniel looked unsettled. I miss when money didn't feel like a meeting, he said quietly. I closed the journal gently. It always was, I replied. You just didn't have to attend. That sentence landed between us without sharpness, but with weight. He leaned back in his chair. I didn't realize how much pressure you were under before, he admitted. I thought you just liked managing it. I smiled faintly. I'm good at managing it. That's different. Silence settled again. And in that silence, I understood something irreversible. Even if we returned to the old dynamic, even if I resumed absorbing everything quietly, I wouldn't be able to unknow what it felt like to share the weight. Clarity had changed me. There was no going back to unconscious imbalance. That's what too late meant. Not that the marriage was ending, but that was the illusion. Daniel reached across the table and rested his hand over mine. I'm sorry, he said. Not for the spending, for not seeing you. And that was the first apology that mattered. Not for a late fee, not for an upgrade. For invisibility, but apologies don't rewind experience. They acknowledge it. And something inside me had already restructured. I no longer felt anxious, but I also no longer felt willing to shrink myself to maintain ease. If Daniel had resisted structure, if he had dismissed the process repeatedly, I would have had to make a harder decision. Because respect, once fractured, requires sustained repair. And I was prepared for that reality. But here's what truly made it too late. I had strengthened myself independently. My income had increased. My retirement contributions were substantial. Legal documents were clear. Contingencies existed. I was no longer operating from fear of instability. I was operating from choice. And choice changes posture. Daniel sensed it. You don't seem scared anymore, he said one night as we prepared for bed. I'm not, I answered honestly. That honesty wasn't threatening. It was grounding. Because when fear leaves, resentment has nowhere to hide. What remained was the truth. Truth that we had nearly allowed a silent imbalance to erode the partnership. Truth that love without structure can become lopsided. Truth that I would never again carry invisible responsibility alone. Too late to return to blindness. Too late to pretend it was just personality differences. Too late to ignore the cost of silence, but not too late to build something stronger. The question was no longer whether our marriage would survive money. It was whether it would mature because of it. And that answer required one final step, a conversation without heat, without blame, without performance, just truth. The final conversation didn't happen during a review. It happened on a quiet Sunday afternoon, laundry humming in the background. Our son is at a friend's house, no urgency, no deadline. I asked Daniel to sit with me on the patio. No laptop, no journal, no spreadsheets, just us. I need to say something clearly, I began. He nodded, attentive but not tense. I'm not angry, I said, and I'm not keeping score, but I need you to understand what almost happened. He didn't interrupt. Our marriage didn't almost break because of infidelity. It almost broke because I was slowly becoming the only adult in one area that determined stability. His jaw tightened slightly, not in defense but in recognition. I didn't feel partnered, I continued. I felt responsible. And responsibility without shared awareness becomes loneliness. The word lingered. Loneliness. Not abandonment, not betrayal. Loneliness. Daniel looked down at his hands. I thought trusting you was love, he said quietly. I know, SSSSU, I replied, but delegating everything isn't partnership, it's outsourcing. There was no accusation in my voice, just clarity. And I don't want to outsource parts of our life that shape our future. I want you inside them with me. He inhaled slowly. I was comfortable, he admitted, and I didn't realize comfort for me meant pressure for you. That was the closest we had come to naming it directly. Comfort and pressure. Same system, different experience. I reached for his hand. I don't need you to become me, I said. I need you to stay engaged. Even when it's boring, even when it's inconvenient. He nodded, eyes steady now. I can do that. I know you can, I said. The question is whether you will consistently. There it was. Not dramatic, not threatening, just accountability. He didn't promise perfection. He didn't overcorrect with grand gestures. He said something better. I don't want you to ever feel alone in this again. And for the first time, I believed him. Not because of emotion, but because of behavior over the past months. Confrontation without heat is powerful. It removes ego from the room. There was no raised voice, no tears, no accusations of you always or you never, just truth delivered steadily. And in that steadiness, something recalibrated. Not because I demanded it, because I refused to minimize it. When we stood to go back inside, Daniel wrapped his arms around me. Not performative, not desperate. Grounded. I'm glad you didn't keep this quiet, he said. So was I. Because silence had nearly cost us more than any purchase ever could. And speaking calmly had restored something deeper than numbers. It restored parity. Not perfect, but real. I am still the organized one. I still update spreadsheets. I still feel a quiet satisfaction when projections align and accounts reconcile cleanly. But I am no longer invisible inside that role. The difference isn't dramatic from the outside. Our house looks the same. Our routines are similar. We still laugh. We still plan trips. Thoughtfully now, not impulsively. But internally, something fundamental has shifted. I no longer confuse endurance with love. For years, I believed absorbing stress silently was generosity. That if I could carry it without complaint, I was protecting our marriage. Now I understand something more nuanced. Protection without participation creates imbalance. And imbalance, left unchecked, breeds quiet resentment. Who I am now is not harder. I am clearer, clear about my limits, clear about shared responsibility, clear about the fact that partnership requires visibility, not assumption. Daniel and I still differ in temperament. He is more optimistic. I am more structured. But those differences now operate inside agreed boundaries. We review finances together without tension, not because numbers are exciting, but because they represent something larger, mutual stewardship. And perhaps the most important change is internal. I am no longer afraid of what would happen if I stopped compensating. That fear used to drive everything. It made me overfunction, overthink, overcarry. Now, I know two things with certainty. First, I am capable of standing on my own if I ever need to. Not because I want to, but because I prepared responsibly. Second, I don't have to stand alone inside my marriage anymore. That combination, independence and interdependence, is powerful. I don't monitor Daniel with suspicion. I don't audit him. I don't hover. I trust the structure we built together. And when trust rests on structure instead of assumption, it feels lighter. There's a quiet confidence that comes from confronting something before it breaks you. Our marriage didn't collapse, but it could have. Not loudly, not scandalously, just slowly, through erosion, through one partner feeling unseen, through comfort disguising imbalance. Who I am now is a woman who speaks before resentment settles, a woman who understands that love is not proven by how much you endure silently, but by how honestly you engage. And perhaps most importantly, I am a woman who no longer mistakes being indispensable for being valued, because true value is shared, not absorbed, not hidden, shared. If you had asked me years ago what could threaten my marriage, I would have said betrayal, dishonesty, a catastrophic event. I wouldn't have said autopay settings. I wouldn't have said lifestyle creep. I wouldn't have said the quiet loneliness of being the only one tracking due dates at midnight. But that's the truth. My marriage almost broke over money. Not because we didn't have it, but because we weren't carrying it together. Unpaid bills weren't the issue. Different spending habits weren't the issue. Unspoken stress was. Silence was. Assumption was. We tell ourselves that love covers everything. That if there's no cheating, no screaming, no dramatic fracture, we're fine. But erosion doesn't announce itself. It happens when one person absorbs responsibility so well that the other forgets it exists. What saved us wasn't a grand apology. It wasn't a financial windfall. It was clarity. Clarity in numbers, clarity in language, clarity in boundaries, and the courage to say calmly, I don't want to carry this alone anymore. There was no revenge, no humiliation, no scorekeeping, just two adults choosing to mature. If you're watching this and thinking, it's not that bad, I understand. That's exactly what I told myself for years. But ask yourself something gently. Are you managing or are you partnering? Are you silent because there's peace or because you're afraid of disrupting comfort? Money is rarely just money. It's trust, it's visibility, it's a shared responsibility. And when handled consciously, it can actually strengthen what it once strained. If this story resonated with you, I'd love to hear your perspective. Have you ever felt alone in a responsibility inside your relationship, even when everything looked fine from the outside? Let's talk about it.